Hey there, angry faithful. I just wanted to drop in, bend your ear a little bit, get your attention. So if you're not listening, drop what you're doing and pay attention to me because I'm here to inform you that not only can you get your daily, maybe if you're binging it, I'm not sure, that's entirely up to you, but you can multiply your doses of angry me fuckery by paying attention to all of the platforms upon which you can find either the dulcet tones of my voice and David's voice or my pretty face and David's not so pretty face. Anyways, digressing, we not only on we are on YouTube, we are on Spotify, we're on Rumble, we're on Google, Apple Podcast. We have a TikTok page. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and of course Facebook. So if you find yourself fuckery deprived, curl up with a nice hot mug of shut the fuck up and just listen. Open those ear holes and be prepared to be cream pied like it's the first time. Thanks for listening.
Welcome, Angry Faithful. Today on Psychos and Sociopaths, we're going to do a English one again since I found out we're actually somewhat growing in the UK. So to all our UK listeners, thank you for listening, watching, whatever you're doing. Thanks for just, being sticking around with us, even though half the time we get like a little bit over ourselves and we just go off subject half the time. No, 80% of the time, not half. But anyways, today we're gonna go
being very generous to ourselves.
Yeah. But today we're gonna go over Dennis Nilsen. He was a Scottish serial killer and a necrophiliac who murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983 in London.
What is it about necrophiles, dude, that they gravitate towards the same sex?
My opinion, and I actually did think about this. I thought about it actually this week. I didn't talk to BC about it, but I was thinking to myself. And what I was thinking was the basic fact of they had this feeling with this. Well, now it would be a body, and they had to go back for it to feel that same feeling. That's how they get the euphoria. That's how they get off, basically.
Right.
And doing that. So that's my theory, but that's the only thing I can come up with. With men, I know with men, when they're doing that, when they're murdering or doing horrible stuff to people, raping them and everything like that, they have that power over the person.
Right.
Sometimes it is for women a little bit too, but it's more with men because they do the other acts where like what's the ripping of the breasts. If it can you not hear yourself?
I can. So I can hear that. I can hear that. I hear you over my computer speaker still. So for those of you who
move the mic up a little bit more, then I mean it's not going to help with this computer speakers or anything like that. But
yeah, no, I mean, do you hear yourself though?
No,
over my computer.
No. Did you hook it up to the soundboard or did you hook it up to your laptop?
Well, I took the USB and I hooked it up to my Mac, but the microphone and all that is going through the soundboard.
And you're using something that uses that has a mic for the headset.
No, this is just a straight up headset.
Okay.
But the headset's plugged into the egghead. And I mean, I can hear myself.
Oh, did you turn up the egghead?
Yeah, I mean, that's the volume that I was using right there. See, now, I mean, I can hear myself just fine over the egghead, over my headset. So I can hear myself.
I think,
And I can hear you, but I can hear you more over the computer than I can in my ear.
Oh, okay. Why don't you just try muting the laptop? And this happens in every episode we end up.
Okay, so let me try this here. Hold on. Go ahead and try it now.
Can you hear me now?
Say it again.
Can you hear me now?
I can still hear you over the laptop. That's weird, dude.
Oh, wow.
I will. You know what? Hold on. Okay, so there's that. And then
This is so funny.
Say something.
Okay, Belarus.
I can't.
Well, it's just something we're gonna have to figure.
It's all right, man.
But we're gonna go with the early life of Dennis. Dennis Andrew Nelson was born 23rd November 1945 in Frishburg,
Fraserburg, Aberdeenshire.
Okay, thank God you said that because I was struggling.
You're going to use Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, I was about to use Stephen Hawking. The second of three children born.
We are a professional setup, man.
Oh yeah, professional. Three children born in Elizabeth Duth White and Olaf Magus Macshamer. And you can you can comment on this to see if I'm saying that right because I have no idea.
Okay. Elizabeth Duthie White and Olaf Magnus Mooksheim.
Okay.
Who had the adopted surname of Nilsen. Mooksheim was a Norwegian soldier who had traveled to Scotland in 1940 as part of the Free Norwegian forces following the German occupation of Norway. After a brief courtship, he married Elizabeth White in May of 1942. The newlyweds moved into her parents' house. I really need to quit doing that because if we had a high listener rate up in the UK, it's quickly dropped because they're like, listen to this fucker over
here. Either that or it's like, I can't understand a word he says because most.
Well, if I'm doing the accent correctly, the only people that can understand me is going to be people from that part of the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's that. You want me to read the early life part of it? The childhood?
Yeah, I got it. The marriage between Nelson's parents was difficult. Ola Nelson did not view marriage life with any seriousness, being preoccupied with his duties as a Free Norwegian forces and making little attempts to spend much time with or finding a new home for his wife. After the birth of his third child, Nelson's mother concluded she had rushed into marriage without thinking. The couple divorced in 1948. All three of the couple's children, Olaf Jr., Dennis, and Sylvia, had been conceived on their father's brief visits to the mother's household. Her parents, Andrew and Lily White, who had never approved of the daughter's choice of husbands, were supportive of their daughter's following her divorce and considerate of their grandchildren. Nelson was quite yet adventurous child. His early childhood memories were of family picnics in Scotland countryside, with his mother and siblings, and his grandparents' poniest lifestyle, which they would describe cold and dour. Is that right, dour?
Let me see here. Dower.
Doer.
Dour. No, I had it right. Wow.
I'm going with dower. Cold and dower.
And of being taken on long countryside walks, carried on a shoulders of his maternal grandfather, to whom he was practically close. Ollie Jr. and Sylvia occasionally accompanied Dennis and his grandfather on these walks, despite only being 5 years old. Nilsen vividly recalled these walks being very long, along the harbor, across the wide stretch of beaches, up to the sand dunes, which rise 30 feet behind the beach, and onto the. Yep, we're gonna Stephen Hawking this.
Inverlochie.
Inverlochie. He later described this stage of his childhood as one contentment, and his grandfather being great hero and protector, adding that whenever his grandfather, who was a fisherman, was at sea, life would be empty for me until he returned. By 1951, Nelson's grandfather's health declined, but he continued to work. On the 30th of October 1951, while fishing in the North Sea, he died of a heart attack at age of 62. His body was brought ashore, returned to the White family's home prior to burial. And what Nelson later described as his most vivid child recollection. His mother weeping, asking him whenever he wanted to see his grandfather. When he replied that he did, he was taken into the room where his grandfather lay in an open coffin. As Nelson gazed upon the body, his mother told him his grandfather was sleeping, adding that he had gone to a better place. And the years followed. The death of his grandfather, Nelson's become more quiet and withdrawn, often standing alone at the harbor watching the herring boats. At home, he seldom participated in family activities and retreated from any attempts by adult family members to demonstrate any affection towards him. Nelson grew to resent what he saw as an unfair amount of attention his mother, grandmother, and later stepfather displayed towards his other brother and younger sister. Nelson envied Olaf Jr.'s popularity. He often talked to and played games with his younger sister, Sylvia, to whom he was closer than any other family member. On one of his solo excursions to the beach to Image-Gorja in 1954 to 1955, Nelson became submerged beneath the water and almost dragged out to sea. He initially pancaked, failing his arms and shouting. As he gripped for air, which wasn't there, he recalled believing that his grandfather was about to arrive and pull him out before experiencing a sense of tranquility. His life was saved by another youth who dragged him to shore. Shortly after this incident, Nelson's mother moved out of his grandparents' home and into a flat with her 3 children. She later married a builder who was named Andrew Scott. I just missed that freaking. I just had this thought of Blazing Saddles. Andrew Scott. I don't know why. With whom she had 4 more children in many years. Although Nelson initially resented his stepfather, whom he viewed as an unfair disciplinarian.
Disciplinarian.
I said that.
Okay.
He gradually came to grudgingly respect him. The family moved to Strinich in 1955. At the onset of puberty, Nelson discovered that he was gay, which initially confused and shamed him. He kept his sexuality hidden from his family and few friends because of many of the boys to whom he was attracted had facial features similar to those of his younger sister Sylvia. On one occasion, he sexually fondled her, believing that his attraction towards boys might be a
Manifestation.
Of the care he felt for her. Nelson made no effort to seek sexual contact with any of his peers to whom he was sexually attracted, although he later said he had been fondled by an older youth and did not find the experience unpleasant. On one occasion, he also caressed and fondled the body of his older brother as he slept. As a result of this, Olaf Jr. began to suspect his brother was gay and regularly belittled him in public, referring to him as hen, a Scotland dialect for girl. Nelson initially believed that his fondling of his sister may have been evidence of him being bisexual.
That happened.
Huh?
I said that happened.
Yeah.
I knocked my microphone off the desk.
What'd you do?
I knocked my microphone clean off the desk. I'm just like, huh, okay.
Dude,
You
you're
know,
like a big
I'm
echo. Is
reading
everything
along.
attached?
Hold on. I'm listening to you and I'm reading along, and I'm I'm juggling this poker chip.
Uh-huh.
It just flew right out of my hand. I went to go catch it and knock the microphone right off.
Hey, I'm almost done with this. We can do the arms. You can do the arm service.
Oh, okay. Wait.
As Nelson progressed into adolescence, he found life in Strinich increasingly stifling, with limited entertainment amenities or career opportunity. He respected his parents' effort to provide and care for their children, but began to resent the fact that his family was poor than most of his peers, with his mother and stepfather making no effort to better their lifestyles. Thus, Nelson seldom invited his friends to his family home. At age 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force, viewing the British Army as a potential avenue for escape as his rich rural origins.
Okay. So that sounds really disturbing.
It sounds really horrible. I mean, you were good starting out, and then it just started.
What about now?
Check your cords on your mic. You might have just accidentally pulled it out.
So Nilsen's scholastic record was above average. He displayed a flair for history and art, but shunned sports. He finished his schooling in 1961 and briefly worked in a canning factory as he considered which career path he should choose. After 3 weeks at the factory, Nilsen informed his mother that he intended to join the army, where he intended to train as a chef. Nilsen passed the entrance exams and received official notification that he was to enlist for 9 years service in September of 1961. Commencing his training with the Army Catering Corps at St. Omar Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire. Sorry, it's not Hampshire, it's Hampshire. Within weeks, Nilsen began to excel in his Army duties. He later described his 3 years of training at Aldershot as the happiest of my life. He relished the travel opportunities afforded him in his training and recalled as a highlight his regiment taking part in a ceremonial parade attended by both the Queen and Field Marshal Lord Montgomery of Alamein. While stationed at Aldershot, Nilsen's latent feelings began to stir, but he kept his sexual orientation well hidden from his colleagues. Nilsen never showered in the company of his fellow soldiers for fear of developing an erection in their presence, instead opting to bathe alone in the bathroom, which also afforded him the privacy to masturbate without discovery. In 1964, He passed his initial catering exam and was officially assigned to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany, where he served as a private. In this deployment, Nilsen began to increase his intake of alcohol. He described himself and his colleagues as a hardworking, boozy lot. His colleagues recalled he often drank to excess in order to ease his shyness. On one occasion, Nilsen and a German youth drank themselves into a stupor. When Nilsen awoke, he found himself on the floor of the German youth's flat. No sexual activity had occurred, but this incident fueled Nilsen's sexual fantasies, which initially involved his sexual partner, invariably a young, slender male, being completely passive. These fantasies gradually evolved into his partner being unconscious or dead. On several occasions, Nilsen also made tentative efforts to have his own prone body sexually interfered with by one of his colleagues. In these instances, whenever he and his colleagues drank to excess, Nilsen would pretend he was inebriated in the hope one of his colleagues would make sexual use of his supposedly unconscious body. Following 2 years of service, following 2 years of service,
Basically, he would lie there and just he was like, I'm not gay, but here's my butthole.
I'm not gay, but because you're the one doing the pushing.
Yeah.
Following his 2 years of service in Osnabrück, Nilsen returned to Aldershot, where he passed his official catering exam before being deployed to serve as a cook for the British Army in Norway in 1967. He was deployed to the state of Aden, formerly Aden Colony, where he served again as a cook at the Al Mansour prison. This posting was more dangerous than his previous postings in West Germany or Norway, and Nilsen later recalled his regiment losing several men, often in ambushes en route to the army barracks. Nilsen was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver who beat him unconscious and placed him in the boot of his car, the trunk. Upon being dragged out of the boot of the taxi, Nilsen grabbed a jack handle and knocked the taxi driver to the ground before beating him unconscious. Then he locked the man in the boot of the taxi. Unlike his previous postings, Nilsen had his own room while stationed in Aden. This afforded him the privacy to masturbate without discovery. He developed his fantasies of sex with an unresistant or deceased partner unfulfilled. Nilsen compensated by imagining sexual encounters with an unconscious body as he masturbated while looking at his own prone, nude body in a mirror. On one occasion, Nilsen discovered that by using a freestanding mirror, he could create an effect whereby, if positioning the mirror so his head was out of view, he could visualize himself engaged in a sexual act with another man. That is some thought.
That's
some effort.
Yeah. I mean, you would have to work. He would have to lay down on the bed, move it. I mean, you could probably like etch it out. Go up and someone's going up to
How about I just keep reading because you're going down a road and
yeah.
So, to Nilsen, this ruse created the ideal circumstance in which he could visually split his personality. In these masturbatory fantasies, Nilsen alternatively envisaged himself as being both the domineering and the passive partner. These fantasies gradually evolved to incorporate his own near-death experience with the Arab taxi driver, the dead bodies he'd seen in Aden, and imagery within a 19th century oil painting entitled The Raft of the Medusa, which depicts an old man holding the limp, nude body of a dead youth as he sits aside the dismembered body of another young male. In Nilsen's most vividly recalled fantasy, a slender, attractive young blonde soldier who had recently been killed in battle is dominated by a faceless, dirty gray-haired man who washed this body before engaging in intercourse with the spread eagle corpse. When Nilsen completed his deployment in Aden, he returned to the UK and was assigned to serve with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders at Seaton Barracks in Plymouth, Devon. Throughout his service with this regiment, he was required to cook for 30 soldiers and 2 officers on a daily basis. Nilsen served at these barracks for 1 year before being transferred with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders to Cyprus in 1969. Months later, the regiment was transferred to West Berlin, where the same year Nilsen had his first sexual experience with a female, a prostitute whose services he solicited. He bragged of this sexual encounter to his colleagues, but later stated he found intercourse with a female both overrated and depressing. Well, there's a lot that said she might not have been that good.
No.
Following a brief period with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in Inverness, Nilsen was selected to cook for the Queen's Royal Guard before, in January 1971, being reassigned to serve as a cook for a different regiment in the Shetland Highlands, where he ended his 11-year military career at the rank of corporal in October of 1972.
God, 11 years he only made corporal?
Well, you got to imagine that particular MOS probably didn't leave for a lot of room for advancement.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess back then, I suppose.
I mean, and on top of that, when you look at the numbers of the people that he was assigned to cook for, he probably didn't have a lot of people over him or under him.
Yeah.
Between October and December of 72, Nilsen lived with his family as he considered his next career move. On more than one occasion in the 3 months Nilsen lived in Strickland, his mother voiced her opinion as to her being more concerned with his lack of female companionship than his career path, and of her desire to see him marry and start a family. On one occasion, Nilsen joined his older brother Olaf Jr., his sister-in-law, and another couple to watch a documentary about gay men. All present viewed the topic with derision, except Nilsen, who ardently spoke in defense of gay rights. A fight ensued, after which Olaf Jr. informed his mother that Dennis was gay. Nilsen never spoke to his older brother again and maintained only sporadic written contact with his mother, stepfather, and younger siblings. He decided to join the Metropolitan Police and moved to London in December to begin the training course. Now, in April of 73, Nilsen completed his police training and was posted to Wildesden Green. Still a cadet and junior constable, he performed several arrests, but never had to physically subdue a member of the public. Nilsen enjoyed the work, but missed the comradeship of the army. He began to drink alone in the evenings. During the summer and autumn of 73, Nilsen began frequenting gay pubs and engaged in several casual liaisons with men. He viewed these encounters as soul-destroying liaisons in which he would only lend his partner his body in a vain search for inner peace.
Jesus.
And he sought a lasting relationship. In August, following a failed relationship, Nilsen came to the conclusion that his personal lifestyle was at odds with his job. His birth father died the same month, leaving each one of his children 1,000 pounds, the equivalent of about 9,693 pounds as of 2022. In December, Nilsen resigned from the police. Between December of 73 and May of 74, he worked as a security guard. The work was intermittent, and he resolved to find more stable, secure employment. He found work as a civil servant in May 1974. He was initially posted to a job center in Denmark Street, where his primary role was to find employment for unskilled laborers. At his workplace, Nilsen was known to be a quiet, conscientious employee who was active in the trade union movement. His attendance record was mediocre, although he frequently volunteered to work overtime, leading several colleagues to suspect he was something of a loner. In 79, Nilsen was appointed acting executive officer. He was officially promoted to the position of executive officer with additional supervisory responsibilities in June of 1982 and transferred to another job center in Kentish Town, continuing his job until his arrest.
Now, in November 1975, Nilsen encountered a 20-year-old man named David Gallichan.
Gallichan.
Gallichan. Being threatened outside a pub by two other men. Nelson intervened in the altercation and took Gallahan into his room at 80th Treadmouth Road in the Crickle Woods district in North London. The two men spent the evening drinking and talking. Nelson learned that Gallahan had recently moved to London from Weston super Mare, Somerset, was gay, unemployed, and resided in a hostel. The following morning, both men agreed to live together in a large residence, and Nelson, using part of his inheritance bequeathed to it by his father, immediately resolved to find a larger property. Several days later, the pair viewed a vacant ground floor flat at 195th Melrose Avenue, also in Cricklewood, and they decided to move into the property. Prior to moving to Melrose Avenue, Nelson negotiated a deal with the landlord whereby he and Galligan had exclusive use of the garden in the rear of the property. The flat was supposed to be furnished, but upon moving in, the pair found it to be largely barren. Over the following months, the couple redecorated and furnished the entire flat. Much of this work was performed by Galligan, as Nelson, having discovered Galligan's lack of employment ambitions, began to view himself as the breadwinner of the relationship. Nelson later recollected that he was sexually attracted to Galligan, but the two seldom had intercourse. And initially, Nelson experienced a domestic contentment with Galligan, but within a year of them moving into Melrose Avenue, the superficial relationship between the two men began to show signs of strain. They slept in separate beds and both began to bring home casual sex partners. Galligan later insisted Nelson had never been violent towards him, but that he did engage in verbal abuse, and the pair had begun arguing increasingly frequently by early of 1976. Nelson later stated that following a heated argument in May 1977, he demanded Galligan leave the residence. Galligan later informed investigators that he had chosen to end the relationship. So he didn't die because he got busy with him. Nelson formed a brief relationship with several other young men over the following 18 months. One of these relationships lasted more than a few weeks, and none of the men expressed any invitation of living with him on a permanent basis. By late 1978, Nelson was living a solitary existence. He had experienced at least 3 failed relationships in the previous 18 months. He later confessed to having developed an increasing conviction that he was unfit to live with. Throughout 1978, he devoted an ever-increasing amount of his time, effort, and assaultery to his work. And most evenings he spent consuming spirits and or lager as he listened to music. Between 1978 and 1983, Nelson is known to have killed a minimum of 12 men and boys and to have attempt to kill several others. He initially confessed in 1983 to having killed about 16 victims. The majority of Nelson's victims were homeless or gay men. Would it be like homeless gay men or just gay men? I guess homeless men don't need a
Well, just like with anything in this society nowadays, you have to be specific. Just like you can't just have an American, you got to have an white American or an African American or an Asian American. everybody's got to have labels, and it's just like this insane pronoun crap that they've got going on these days. And it's just like even teachers in the state of Texas, they can't address a child by a pronoun.
Yeah, I wouldn't care. I hate that stuff too. But where was I at? Oh yeah, there we go. Other were homosexual people he typically met in bars, on public transportation, and on one occasion outside his home. All Nelson's murders were committed inside the 2 North London addresses where he resided, and the years he is known to have killed. His victims were lured to the addresses through guile, typically the offer of alcohol or shelter. Inside Nelson's home, the victims were usually given food and alcohol, then strangled, typically with linen what?
Ligature.
Ligature, either to death or until they have been unconscious. If the victim had been strangled into unconsciousness, Nelson then drowned him in the bathtub, his sink, or bucket of water before observing a ritual in which he bathed, clothed, and retained the bodies inside his residence for several weeks and occasionally months before he dismembered them. Each victim, killed between 1978 and 1981 at his Crockwood residence, was disposed of by via burning upon a bonfire prior to their dissection. Nelson removed their inner organs, which he disposed of either beside a furnace behind his flat or closed to Granston Park. The victims killed in 1982 to 1983 at his Muswell Hill residence were retained at his flat, with their fresh and smaller bones flushed down the toilet. Nelson admitted to engaging in masturbation as he viewed the nude bodies of several of his victims, and he was engaging in sexual acts with 6 of his victims' body, but was admitted that he had never penetrated any of his victims. Wow, that's great that he never penetrated. Oh my God. Sometimes I'm reading these things and I'm like, really that's your limit. That's what you're gonna sign off to the parents and everything.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I lost track of where you're at. Where are you at?
195th Melrose Avenue.
Okay, so Nilsen killed. Yeah, that's exactly what you thought it was. Okay, Nilsen killed his first victim, 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, on 30 December 1978. Holmes encountered Nilsen in the Cricklewood Arms pub, where Holmes had unsuccessfully attempted to purchase alcohol. According to Nilsen, he had been drinking heavily alone on the day he met Holmes before deciding in the evening that he must at all costs leave his flat and seek company. Nilsen invited Holmes to his house with the promise of the 2 drinking alcohol and listening to music, believing him to be approximately 17 years old. At Nilsen's home, both he and Holmes drank heavily before they fell asleep. The following morning, Nilsen woke to find the sleeping Holmes beside him on his bed. In his subsequent written confessions, Nilsen stated he was afraid to wake him in case he left me. After caressing the sleeping youth, Nilsen decided Holmes was to stay with me over the new year, whether he wanted to or not. Reaching for a necktie, Nilsen straddled Holmes as he strangled him into unconsciousness before drowning the teenager in a bucket filled with water. Nilsen then washed the body in his bathtub before placing Holmes on his bed and caressing his body. He twice masturbated over the body before awaiting the passing of rigor mortis to enable him to stow the corpse beneath his floorboards. Holmes' bound corpse remained beneath the floorboards for almost 8 months before Nilsen built a bonfire in the garden behind his flat and burned the body on August 11th, 1979. Reflecting on his killing spree in 1983, Nilsen stated that having killed Holmes, I caused dreams which caused death. This is my crime, adding that he had started down the avenue of death in possession of a new kind of flatmate. On October 11th, 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met in a St. Martin's Lane pub and lured to his flat on the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who managed to flee from his flat and reported the incident to police. Nilsen was questioned in relation to the incident, but Ho decided not to press charges. And after 2 months, or 2 months after the attempted murder of Ho on 3 December of 1979, Nilsen encountered a 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Ogden. Ogden. That's what I'm going with. Let it be. Who had been on a tour of England visiting relatives. Nilsen encountered Ogden as they both drank in a West End pub. Upon learning the young man was a tourist, Nilsen offered to show Ogden several London landmarks, an offer of which Ogden accepted. Nilsen then invited the student to his house on the promise of a meal and further drinks. The pair stopped at an off license, which, for those of you keeping score at home, an off license is a liquor store. So there you go. En route to Nilsen's residence and purchased whiskey, rum, and beer. That sounds like a good time. Without insisting on sharing the bill. Nilsen was adamant that he could not recall the precise moment he strangled Ogden, but recalled that he strangled the young man with the cord of his headphones as Ogden listened to music. He also recalled dragging Ogden across his floor with the wire wrapped around his neck as he strangled him, before pouring himself a glass of rum and continuing to listen to music on the headphones of which he had just strangled Ogden. Following day, Nilsen purchased a Polaroid camera and photographed Ogden's body in various suggestive positions. He then laid Ogden's corpse spread eagle above him on his bed as he watched television for several hours before wrapping the body in plastic bags and storing the corpse beneath the floorboards. On approximately 4 occasions over the following fortnight, Nilsen was disinterred Ogden's body from beneath his floorboards and seated up the body upon his armchair alongside as he watched television and drank alcohol. Nilsen killed his third victim, 16-year-old Martin Duffy, on 17th of May of 1980. Duffy was a catering student from Birkenhead, Merseyside, who had hitchhiked to London without his parents' knowledge. And on 13 May, after being questioned by British Transport Police for evading his train fare, for 4 days, Duffy had slept off near Postern Railway Station before Nilsen encountered the youth as he returned from a union conference in Southport. Duffy, Nilsen recollected, was both exhausted and hungry, and eventually accepted Nilsen's offer of a meal and a bed for the evening. After the youth had fallen asleep in Nilsen's bed, Nilsen fashioned a ligature around his neck, and then simultaneously sat on Duffy's chest and tightened the ligature with a great force. So basically, it's like a tourniquet, almost. Yeah. Nilsen held this grip until Duffy became unconscious. Then he dragged the youth into his kitchen and drowned him in his sink before bathing the body, which he recalled as being the youngest looking I'd ever seen. Duffy's body was first placed upon a kitchen chair, then upon the bed, which he had been strangled. The body was repeatedly kissed, complimented, and caressed by Nilsen both before and after he had masturbated, while sitting upon the stomach of the corpse. For 2 days, Duffy's body was stowed in the cupboard before Nilsen noted signs of bloating, therefore he went straight under the floorboards. Following Duffy's murder, Nilsen began to kill with increasing frequency. By the end of 1980, he killed further 5 victims and attempted to murder 1 other. Only one of these victims from Nilsen murdered, 26-year-old William Sutherland, has ever been identified. Nilsen's recollections of the unidentified victims were vague, but He graphically recalled how each victim had been murdered and just how long the body had been retained before dissection. One unidentified victim killed in November had moved his legs in a cycling motion as he was strangled. Nilsen is known to have abstained himself from work between 11 and 18 November, likely due to this particular murder. Another unidentified victim, Nilsen had unsuccessfully attempted to resuscitate before sinking his knees, or to his knees and sobbing before standing to expressly spit at his own image as he looked at himself in the mirror. On another occasion, he had lain in bed alongside the body of another unidentified victim as he listened to the classical theme Fanfare for the Common Man before bursting into tears. Inevitably, the accumulated bodies beneath Nilsen's floorboards attracted insects and created a foul odor, particularly throughout summer months. And on occasions, Nilsen disinterred victims from beneath the floorboards. He noted that the bodies were covered with papae and infested with maggots. Some victims' heads had maggots crawling out of eye sockets and mouths. He placed deodorants beneath the floorboards and sprayed insecticide about the flat twice daily, but the odor of decay and presence of flies remained. In late 1980, Nilsen removed and dissected the bodies of each victim killed since December of 79 and burned them upon a communal bonfire he had constructed on a raceground behind his flat. To disguise the smell of burning flesh of the six dissected bodies placed upon his pyre, Nilsen crowned the bonfire with an old car tire. There, neighborhood children stood to watch this particular bonfire. Nilsen later wrote in his memoirs that he felt it would have seemed in order if he had seen these three children dancing around a mass funeral pyre. When the bonfire had been reduced to ashes and cinders, Nilsen used a rake to search the debris for any recognizable bones. Noting the skull was still intact, he smashed it into pieces with his rake. On or about 4 January of 1981, Nilsen encountered an unidentified man whom he described for investigators as an 18-year-old blue-eyed young Scot at the Golden Lion Pub in Soho. He was lured to Melrose Avenue upon the promise of partaking in a drinking contest. After Nilsen and his victim had consumed several beverages, Nilsen strangled him with a tie and subsequently placed the body beneath the floorboards. Nilsen is known to have informed his employers he was ill and unable to attend work until January in order that he could dissect both his victim and another unidentified victim he had killed approximately 1 month earlier. By April, Nilsen had killed 2 further unidentified victims, one of whom he described as an English skinhead whom he had met in Leicester Square. The other he described as a Belfast boy, a man in his early 20s, approximately 5'9", whom he had murdered sometime in February. In relation to the first of these 3 unidentified victims, he later casually reflected, end of the day, end of the drink, end of the person. Billboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street. The following month, Nilsen removed the internal organs of several victims stowed beneath his floorboards. He discarded these innards built upon the waste ground behind his flat and in his household rubbish. The final victim to be murdered at Melrose Avenue was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, whom Nilsen discovered slumped against a wall outside his home on 17 December of 1981. When Nilsen inquired as to Barlow's welfare, he was informed the medication that Barlow was prescribed for his epilepsy had caused his legs to weaken. Nilsen suggested that Barlow should be in hospital, and supporting him, walked him to his residence before phoning for an ambulance. The following day, Barlow was released from the hospital and returned to Nilsen's home, apparently to thank him. He was invited in, and after eating a meal, began drinking rum and coke before falling asleep on the sofa. Nilsen manly strangled Barlow as he slept before stowing the body beneath his kitchen sink the following morning. In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord decided to renovate 195 Melrose Avenue and asked Nilsen to vacate the property. Nilsen was initially resistant to the proposal, but accepted an offer of £1,000 from the landlord to vacate the residence. He moved into an attic flat at 23D Cranley Gardens. in Westborough Hill District in North London on 5 October 1981. The day before he vacated the property, Nilsen burned the dissected bodies of the last 5 victims he had killed at this address upon a third and final bonfire he constructed in the garden behind his flat. Again, Nilsen ensured the bonfire was crowned with a mold car tire to disguise the smell of burning flesh. Nilsen had already dissected the bodies of four of these victims in January and August, and needed only to complete the dissection of Barlow for his third bonfire.
Now, on the 21st of Cranium Gardens, Nilsen had no access to a garden, and as he resided in the attic flat, he was unable to stow any of the bodies beneath the floorboards. For almost 2 months, an acquaintance Nilsen encountered and lured to his flat were not assaulted in any manner. Although he did attempt to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nubbs on the 23rd of November 1981, but he stopped himself from completing the act. In March 1982, Nilsen encountered 23-year-old John Howlett while drinking in a pub near Lancaster Square. Howlett was lured to Nelson's flat and on the promise of continuing drinking at Nelson's. There, both Nilsen and Howlett drank as they watched a film before Howlett walked into Nelson's front room and fell asleep in his bed, which was located in the front room at the time. An hour later, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to rouse Howlett, when then sat on the edge of the bed drinking rum as he stared at Howlett before deciding to kill him. Following a furious struggle in which Howlett himself attempted to strangle his attacker, Nilsen strangled Howlett into unconsciousness with an upholstered strap before returning to a living room, shaking from the stress of the struggle in which he had believed that he would be overpowered. On 3 occasions over the following 10 minutes, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to kill the victim. After nothing, he had resumed breathing before deciding to fill his tub with water and drown him. For over a week following Howlett's murder, Nelson's own neck bore the victim's fingerprints and impressions. In May 1982, Nelson's encountered Carl Studer, a 21-year-old gay man, as the young man drank at the Black Cap pub in Camden. Nilsen engaged Carl in conversation, discovering he was depressed following the failed relationship after prying him with alcohol. Nilsen invited Carl to his flat, assuring his guests he had no intentional sexual activity. At the flat, Carl consumed further alcohol before falling asleep upon opening his sleeping bag. He later awoke to find himself being strangled, but with Nilsen loudly whispering, "Stay still." In his subsequently testimony at Nelson's trial, Schroeder stated he initially believed Nilsen was trying to free him from the zipper of the sleeping bag before he returned to a state of unconsciousness. He then vaguely recalled hearing water running before realizing he was immersed in the water and that Nilsen was attempting to drown him. After briefly succeeding in rising his head above the water, Schroeder gasped the words, "No more, please, no more," before Nilsen again submerged Schroeder head beneath the water. Believing he had killed Schroeder, Nilsen stated the youth in his armchair. When then noted his Mongol dog Bleep licked Schroeder's face, Nilsen, realizing the tiniest thread of life still clung to the youth. He rubbed Schroeder's limbs and heart increased circulation, covering the youth's body with a blanket, then laid him upon his bed. When Schroeder regained consciousness. Nelson embraced him. He then explained to Schroeder he had almost strangled himself on the zipper of the sleeping bag, and he had resuscitated him. After falling 2 days, Schroeder repeatedly lapsed in and out of consciousness. When Schroeder had regained enough strength to question Nelson as to his recollection of being strangled and immersed in cold water, Nelson explained he had become caught in the zipper of the sleeping bag following a nightmare. I mean, that's got to be a freaking badass zipper sleeping bag.
Well, not to have
I'm never seen sleeping bag do that.
well, there's nothing wrong with fart sacks, man. There's really not. But it's one of those situations where I feel bad for these victims. I do. But two words could have prevented all of this. Stranger danger.
Yeah, pretty much stranger danger.
I mean, it's not terribly outside the realm of the impossible to
really. I mean, I've had sleeping bags that, I mean, unless the cord was like probably around about a foot long, the cord for the sleeping bag thing. That's the only way I can think of it.
I mean, I've got my experience with sleeping bags from, when I was a younger, a kid in the Boy Scouts, but like most of my sleeping bag experience as an adult came in the form of a fart sack when I was in the Army.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, and those cords, there's no cords on them. So, but I don't know, man. I don't know.
All right. And about the cold water, you were in shock. Nelson led Schroeder into the nearby railway station, where he informed the young man he hoped they might meet again before he bid him farewell. 3 months after Nelson's June 1982 promotion to the position of executive officer in his employment, he encountered 27-year-old named Graham Allen attempting to hail a taxi in Strasburg Avenue.
Shaftesbury Avenue.
Allen accepted Nelson's offer to accompany him in Cranlery Gardens for a meal. As he had been the case of several previous victims, Nelson stated he could not recall the precise moment he had strangled Allen, but recalled approaching him as he sat eating an omelet with the full intention of murdering him. Allen's body was retained into the bathtub for a total of 3 days before Nelson began to task of dissecting the body upon the kitchen floor. Nelson is again known to have informed his employers he was ill and unable to attend work on 9th of October 1982, likely in order that he could complete the dissection of Allen's body. On the 26th January 1983, Nelson killed his final victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair. Sinclair was last seen by acquaintances in company of Nelson walking to the direction of the tube station, which is basically a subway.
Mm-hmm.
At Nelson's flat, Sinclair fell asleep in a drug and alcohol-induced stupor in the armchair as Nelson sat listening to rock opera Tommy. I'm kind of curious.
It's from The Who.
Oh, okay. I thought I knew him. I got. Oh, I actually listened to that. Nelson approached Sinclair before him and said, said to himself, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." Before strangling Sinclair with a ligature constructed with a necktie and rope.
I don't know why. For some reason, we were talking about the Who, and then when he quoted, quote unquote, "Oh, here I go. Oh, Stephen, here I go again." I don't know why, but I hear White Snake playing in my head.
I do. There's the same thing with me. I heard White Snake. It was so weird. I was like, "Here I go again," and we're doing.
Oh, okay.
Nelson removed these to discover several deep slash marks from where Sinclair had recently tried to kill himself. Following his usual ritual of bathing the body, Nelson laid Sinclair's body upon his bed, applying talcum powder to the body. Then arranged 3 mirrors around the bed before himself, lying naked alongside the dead youth. Several hours later, he turned Stevens' head towards him before kissing the youth's body on the forehead and saying, "Good night, Stephen." Nelson then fell asleep alongside the body. As he had been in the case with both Hollett and Allen, Sinclair's body was subsequently dissected, with various dismembered parts wrapped in plastic bags and stored in either a wardrobe, a tea chest, and within a drawer located beneath the bathtub. The bags used to seal Sinclair's remains were sealed. God Lord, were sealed with the same crepe baguettes Nelson had found upon Sinclair's wrist. Bandages. Okay, fuck. It's getting late. Nelson attempted to dispose of the flesh, internal organs, and smaller bones of all 3 victims killed at Cannery Gardens by flushing their dissected remains down the toilet. I can imagine trying to do that. I can actually.
Meanwhile, here in America, we
Yeah.
have toilets that they advertise can flush an entire bucket of golf balls at the same time.
God, yeah, I know, right? In a practice which he had conducted upon several victims killed in Melrose Avenue, he also boiled the head, hands, and feet and removed the flesh off of these sections of the victim's body. On the 4th of February, 1983, Nelson wrote a letter of contempt to the state agents, a complaint to the state agencies complaining that the drains at the Cannery Gardens were blocked and that sanitation for both himself and other tenants at the property was intolerable. The following day, he refused to allow the acquaintance to enter his property, the reason being he had begun to dismember Sinclair's body on the floor of his kitchen.
Now, for Nilsen's murders, they were first discovered by a Dynarod employee. Dynarod being it's an emergency drainage plumbing company in the UK. So basically, the plumbers figured it out. The employee's name is Michael Catran, who responded to the plumbing complaints made by both Nilsen and the tenants of the Cranley Gardens on February 8th of 83. Opening a drain cover at the side of the house, Catran discovered the drain was packed with a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones of unknown origin. Catran reported his suspicions to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. Now, as Catran had arrived at the property at dusk, he and Wheeler agreed to postpone further investigation into the blockage until the following morning. Prior to leaving the property, Nilsen and fellow tenant Jim Alec convened with Catran to discuss the source of the substances. Now, upon hearing Catran exclaim how similar substance was in appearance to human flesh, Nilsen replied, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." Now, at 7:30 a.m. the following day, Catran and Wheeler returned to Cranley Gardens. by which time the drain had been cleared. This aroused the suspicions of both men. Catran discovered some scrapes of flesh and 4 bones in a pipe leading from the drain which linked to the top flat of the house. To both Catran and Wheeler, the bones looked as if they originated from a human hand. Both men immediately called the police, who, upon closer inspection, discovered further small bones and scrapes of what looked like to the naked eye like either human or animal flesh in the same pipe. These remains were taken to the mortuary at Hornsey, where pathologist David Bowen advised police that the remains were human and that one particular piece of flesh he concluded had been from a human neck, bore a ligature mark. Upon learning from fellow tenants that the top floor flat from where the human remains had been flushed belonged to Nilsen, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and 2 colleagues opted to wait outside the house until Nilsen returned home from work. When Nilsen returned home from work, DCI J introduced himself and his colleagues, explaining that they had come to inquire about the blockage in the drains from his flat. Nilsen asked why the police were interested in his drains and also whether or not the 2 officers present with J were health inspectors. In response, J informed Nilsen that the other 2 were also police officers and requested access to his flat to discuss the matter further. The 3 officers followed Nilsen into his flat, where they immediately noted the odor of rotting flesh. Nilsen questioned further as to why the police were interested in his drains, to which he was informed the blockage had been caused by human remains. Nilsen feigned shock and bewilderment, stating, "Good grief, how awful." In response, Jay replied, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen responded calmly, admitting that the remainder of the body could be found in 2 plastic bags in a nearby wardrobe, from which DCI J and his colleagues noted the overpowering smell of decomposition emanating. The officers did not open the cupboard, but bags in a nearby wardrobe, but asked Nilsen whether there were any other body parts to be found, to which Nilsen replied, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest, not here, but at the police station." He was then arrested and cautioned on suspicion of murder before being taken to Hornsey police station. While en route to the police station, Nilsen was asked whether the remains in his flat belonged to 1 person or 2. Staring out the window of the police car, he replied, 15 or 16 since 1978. That evening, Detective Superintendent Chambers, accompanied by DCI J and Bowen, to Cranley Gardens, where the plastic bags were removed from the wardrobe and taken to Hornsby mortuary. 1 bag was found to contain 2 dissected torsos, one of which had been vertically dissected, in a shopping bag containing various internal organs. The second bag contained a human skull, almost completely devoid of flesh, a severed head, and a torso with arms attached but hands missing. Both heads were found to have been subjected to moist heat. Now, in an interview conducted on the 10th of February, Nilsen confessed that there were further human remains stowed in a tea chest in his living room, with the other remains inside an upturned drawer in his bathroom. The dismembered body parts were the bodies of 3 men, all of whom he had killed by strangulation, usually with a necktie. 1 victim he could not name, another he knew only as John the Guardsman, and the 3rd he identified as Stephen Sinclair. He also stated that beginning in December of 1978, he had killed 12 or 13 men at his former address, 195 Melrose Avenue. Nilsen also admitted to having unsuccessfully attempted to kill approximately 7 other people who had either escaped or on one occasion had been at the brink of death, but had been revived and allowed to leave his residence. A further search for additional remains at Cranley Gardens on 10 February revealed the lower section of the torso.
I'm sorry. Could you imagine that? Going out and just, oh my God, you won the prize. You get to walk away.
Right. Now, further search for additional remains at Cranley Gardens on 10 February revealed the lower section. I just read that. Okay, no, here we go. Revealed a lower section of a torso and 2 legs stowed in a bag in the bathroom, and a skull, and a section of a torso, and various bones in the tea chest. The same day, Nilsen accompanied police to Melrose Avenue, where he indicated the three locations in the rear garden where he had burned the victims, burned the remains of his victims. Catran contacted the Daily Mirror on 10 February, informing the newspaper of the ongoing search for human remains at Cranley Gardens, leading the newspaper to break the story and spark intense national media interest. Now, by February 11th, reporters from the Mirror had obtained photographs from Nilsen's mother in Aberdeenshire, which appeared on the front page the following day. Under English law, the police had 48 hours in which to charge Nilsen or release him. Assembling the remains of the victims killed at Cranley Gardens on the floor of Hornsby's mortuary, Professor Bowen was able to confirm the fingerprints on one body matched those on police files of Sinclair. At 5:40 p.m. on 11 February, Nilsen was charged with Sinclair's murder, and a statement revealing this was released to the press. A formal questioning of Nilsen began the same evening, with Nilsen agreeing to be represented by a solicitor, which solicitor is basically kind of like
It's a lawyer.
It's
England words for you, a lawyer.
what's the word I'm looking for? Like a public defender.
Yeah.
Okay. He had later declined, or it earlier he had declined a solicitor. Now, police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions over the following days in interviews which totaled over 30 hours. Now, Nilsen was adamant that he was uncertain as to why he had killed, simply saying, "I'm hoping you will tell me that." When asked his motive for the murders, he was adamant that the decision to kill was not made until moments before the act of murder. Now, most victims had died by strangulation, and on several occasions he had drowned the victims once they had been strangled into unconsciousness. But once the victim had been killed, he typically bathed the victim's body, shaved any hair from the torso to conform it to his physical ideal, and then applied makeup to any obvious blemishes upon the skin. The body was usually dressed in socks and underpants. Now, before Nilsen draped the victims around him as he talked to the corpse. With most victims, Nilsen masturbated as he stood alongside or knelt above the body, and Nilsen confessed to having occasionally engaged in intercurial sex. Now, it's also known as coitus interfemoris, which is thigh sex, and interfemoral sex. It's a non-penetrative type of sex, so basically he just made a sandwich. That's what he did. But repeatedly stressed to investigators that he had never actually penetrated his victims, explaining that his victims are too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. All the victims' personal possessions were destroyed following the ritual of bathing their bodies in an effort to obliterate their identity prior to their murder, and now becoming what Nilsen described as a prop in his fantasies. In several instances, he talked to the victims' bodies as it remained seated in a chair or prone on his bed. As he recalled being emotional and marveled at the beauty of their bodies with reference to one victim, Kenneth Ogden, Nilsen noted that Ogden's body and skin were very beautiful, adding, "The sight almost brought me to tears." Another unidentified victim had been so emaciated that he had simply been discarded under the floorboards. The bodies of the victims killed at his previous address were kept for as long as decomposition would allow. Upon noting any major signs of decomposition in a body, Nilsen stowed it beneath the floorboards. Now, if a body did not display signs of decomposition, he occasionally alternately stowed it beneath the floorboards and retrieved it before again masturbating as he stood over and laid alongside the body. Makeup again was applied to enhance its appearance and to obscure blemishes. When questioned as to why the heads found at Cranley Gardens had been subjected...
Is that you or me?
I don't need my Siri to... I need her to go away. There we go.
That was weird.
You heard that, right?
Yeah.
Like, wait, on it. What? I thought maybe we had cut off again. Nielsen stated that he had frequently boiled the heads of his victims in a large cooking pot on his stove so that the internal contents evaporated, thus removing the need to dispose of the brain and flesh. Now, the torsos and limbs of the 3 victims killed at this address were dissected within about 1 week of their murder before being wrapped in plastic bags and stowed in the 3 locations he had indicated to police. The internal organs and smaller bones he flushed down the toilet. This practice, which had led to his arrest, had been the only method he would consider to dispose of the internal organs as soft tissue, as, unlike at Melrose Avenue, he had no exclusive use of the garden of the property. Now, at Melrose Avenue, Nilsen typically retained the victims' bodies for a much longer period before disposing of the remains. He kept 3 or 4 bodies stowed beneath the floorboards before he dissected the remains, which he would wrap up inside plastic bags and either return under the floorboards or, in 2 instances, placed inside suitcases, which had been left at the property by a previous tenant. The remains stowed inside suitcases, those of Ogden and Duffy, were placed inside a shed in the rear garden and were disposed of upon the second bonfire Nilsen had constructed at Melrose Avenue. Other dissected remains, minus the internal organs, were returned beneath the floorboards or placed upon a bonfire he had constructed in the garden. And Nilsen confirmed that on 4 occasions he had removed the accumulated bodies from beneath his floorboards and dissected the remains. And on 3 of these occasions, he had then disposed of the accumulated remains upon an assembled bonfire. On more than 1 occasion, he had removed the internal organs from the victims' bodies and placed them in bags, which he then typically dumped behind a fence to be eaten by wildlife. All of the bodies of the victims killed at Melrose Avenue were dismembered after several weeks or months of internment beneath the floorboards. And Nilsen recalled that the putrefaction of these victims' bodies, made this task exceedingly vile. He recalled having to fortify his nerves with whiskey and having to grab handfuls of salt with which to brush aside maggots from the remains. Often he vomited as he dissected the bodies before wrapping the dismembered limbs inside plastic bags and carrying the remains to the bonfires. Nonetheless, immediately prior to his dissecting the victims' bodies, Nilsen masturbated as he knelt or sat alongside the corpse. This, he stated, was his symbolic gesture of saying goodbye to the victims. When questioned as to whether he had any remorse for his crimes, Nilsen replied, "I wish I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." He also emphasized that he took no pleasure from the act of killing, but worshipped the art and the act of death.
On 11th February 1983, Nilsen officially charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. He was transferred to HMP Brixton to be held on remains until his trial. According to Nilsen, upon transferring the Brixton prison awaited trial, his mood was one of resignation and relief, with his belief being that he would be viewed in accordance with the law, having to wear a prison uniform, and that he... What was that? Okay. Having to wear a prison uniform, and he was interrupted to the branches of prison rules. Nilsen threatened to protest against the remaining conditions by refusing to wear any clothes. As a result of this threat, he was not allowed to leave his cell. On August 1st, Nilsen threw his contents of his chamber pot out of his cell, hitting several prison officers. This incident resulting in Nelson's being found guilty on August 9th of assaulting prison officers and subsequently spending 65 days in solitary confinement. On the 26th, May 26th, Nilsen was committed to a standard trial at Old Bailey on 5 counts of murder and 2 attempted murder. A 6th murder charge was later added throughout this communal hearing. He was represented by a solicitor named Ronald Moss, whom he previously dismissed in legal representation on April 21st. Before Moss was reappointed to the role after Nilsen had complained to the magistrate he had been afforded no facilities with which he had mounted his own defense. Moss, who was to remain Nelson's legal representation until July 1983, when Nelson again expressed his intention to defend himself, discharging him until August 5th, when Nelson once again reappointed Moss. Initially, Nelson intended to plead guilty to each charge of murder at his upcoming trial. With Nelson fully content, Moss had fully prepared his defense. 5 weeks before his trial, Nelson again dismissed Moss and opted instead to be represented by Ralph Helms, upon whose advice Nelson agreed to plead not guilty by diminished responsibility. I got that right. Diminished responsibility.
Diminished.
Yeah, I just can't say the word correctly. Yeah. Nelson was brought to trial. Nelson was brought to trial on October 24th, 1983, charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 attempted murder. He was tried at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Crome Johnson and pleaded guilty on all charges. The primary dispute between the prosecution and defense counsel was not whether Nelson had killed the victims, but his state of mind before and during the killing. The prosecution and counsel, Alan Green, QC. What's a QC? Oh, Queen's Counsel. Basically the judge, I guess. Argued that Nelson was sane and in full control of his action and he had killed with premeditation. The defense counsel, Ivan Lawrence, QC, argued that Nelson suffered from diminished responsibility, retaining him incapable of forming the intent to commit murder, and should therefore be convicted only of manslaughter. The prosecution counsel opened the case for the Crown by describing the events of February 1983, leading to the identification of the human remains in the drains at Crowley Gardens and Nelson's subsequently arrest. The discovery of 3 disemboweled bodies in his property, his disdained confession, his lead investigators to the charred bone fragments of 12 fourth victims killed at Melrose Avenue, and the efforts he had taken to conceal his crimes, and a tactful reference to the primary disputes between opposing counsel at the trial. Green closed his opening speech with an answer Nelson had given the police in response to the question as to whether he needed to kill. At the precise moment of the act of murder, I believe I'm right in doing the act. To counteract this argument, Green added, the Crown says that even if there was mentally abnormally that was not sufficiently to diminish substantially his responsibility to the killings. The first witness to testify in the prosecution was Dennis Stewart, who testified that in November 1980, he fell asleep in a chair in Nelson's flat, only to be waking up, finding his ankles bound to the chair, and Nessel stringing him with a tie as he pressed his knee in his chest, successfully overpowering Nilsen. Man, I can't get his name right again. Nilsen.
Mm-hmm.
Nilsen.
God. It's that time of night. Stewart testified that Nelson had to shout, "Take my money." This is the prosecution arrested, reflected Nelson's rotation. Cold presence of mind, in that he hoped to be overheard by other tenants. Upon leaving Nelson's residence, Stewart had reported the attack to the police, who turned questioned Nilsen. Noting conflicted details in the accounts given by both men, police had dismissed the incident as a lover's quarrel. Upon close cross-examination, the defense counsel sought to undermine Stewart's credibility prior to minor inconsistencies in his testimony. The fact he had consumed much alcohol in the night in question suggested his memory had been selectively magnified, as he previously sold his story to the press. On October 25th, the court heard testimony from two further men who had survived attempts by Neely to strangle them. The first of these, Paul Nubbs, provided testimony in which the prosecution asserted was evidence of Nelson's self-control and an ability to refrain from homicidal impulses. As a university student, Nubbs testified that he accompanied Nilsen to Cranley Gardens for alcohol and sex, and woke in the early hours of the morning with a terrible headache. Upon washing his face in Nelson's bathroom, Nubbs noted his eyes were bloodshot and his face completely red. Nilsen exclaimed, "God, you look bloody awful." Nilsen then advised the youth to see a doctor. Nubbs had not reported the attack to police for fear of his sexuality being discovered. Contrary to the prosecution's claims, the defense counsel asserted that Nubbs' testimony reflected Nilsen rationally being unable to control his impulses. The fact Nilsen had selected a university student as a potential victim was at odds with the prosecution claim that Nilsen initially selected rootless males who disappear was unlikely to be noted. Immediately after the testimony, Nubbs had concluded Carl Suter took the stand to recount how in May 1982, Nilsen attempted to strangle and drown him before bringing him back to life. Schroeder's voice frequently quivered with emotion as he recounted how Nilsen had repeatedly attempted to drown him in the bathtub, as he pleaded in vain for his life to be spared, and how he later awoke to find Nelson's Mongol dog licking his face on several occasions. The judge had to allow Schroeder's time to gain his composure. The evidence provided by Schroeder was not included as part of the indictment against Nilsen, as his whereabouts were not known until after the indictment had been completed. DCI-J, when recounted the circumstances of Nelson's arrest and his claims of matter-of-fact confession before reading the court's several statements volunteered by Nilsen, followed his arrest. In one of these statements, Nilsen had said, "I have no tears for my victims. I have no tears for myself, nor do those bereaved by my actions." Good Lord. He just did not give no fucks.
No, he didn't care. I think, yeah, he didn't have any remorse. He didn't have any joy in his life. And this is one of those situations where, it wasn't bad parenting or lazy police work or anything like that. This guy genuinely he was I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, but he was sociopathic. He had no remorse. He was indifferent to life or death. Do I think that nowadays would stuff like that be considered a red flag? Yeah, but with the way that society works and with all of these different groups trying to get inclusion in the alphabet gang,
Well, look at what they did with the Jeffrey Dahmer on Netflix that just came out.
Well,
It
yeah.
said LBQR all alphabets plus, and they're like, why does that matter if he was gay in that show? Like, because he was what, and they had to take it down. That was ridiculous. But anyways,
Yeah, I mean, it was. I'm sure that if somebody came out publicly as a necrophile, that they would be like, "Look, it's my sexual orientation," and the woke community would just be like, "Oh, well, come here, brother."
yeah, I mean, they're doing
So it's not until people start disappearing and ending up in chunks in people's plumbing that it becomes a problem, apparently. So
I mean, that's what they're trying to do with the freaking maps. And even the gay community are trying to get rid of those people. It's so sad. Jay admitted it was unusual for anyone accused of such horrific crimes to be so forthcoming in his providing information, and conceding upon questioning by defense counsel that Nelson not to be providing most of the evidence against him, but also encountering the discovery of evidence which could contract his own version of evidence. Following Jay's testimony, D.S. Chamber recited Nelson's formal confession to the court. His testimony, including graphic description of the ritualistic and sexual acts Nelson performed on his victim's body, his very methods of storage of the bodies and body parts, dismemberment, disposal, and the problems decomposition, particularly regarding colonies of maggots, afforded him. Several jurors were visibly shaken throughout the testimony. Basically, they wanted to throw up. Others looked at Nelson with incredulous expression on their faces as Nelson listened to the testimony with apparent indifference. The testimony, God, I can't say that. No, testimony lasted until the following morning, when the prosecution included several inhabitants into evidence. This included the cooking pot in which Nelson had boiled the heads and 3 victims killed in Callery Gardens, the cutting board he had used to dissect John Hallowett, and several. I hate to tell you this right now, but that picks up on the soundboard and everything.
okay.
That's just funny. I keep on hearing it. Whoop, whoop. And several Russian cutlery knives, which had been formerly belonging to the victim, Marty Duffy. 2 psychologists testified on behalf of the defense. The first of these, James McKeith, began his testimony on October 26. McKeith testified as to how, throughout the lack of emotional development, Nelson experienced difficult expressions, any emotions other than his anger, and his tendencies to treat other human beings as components of his fantasy. The psychologist also described Nelson's association between unconscious bodies and sexual arousal, stating that Nelson processed narcissistic traits.
Narcissistic.
Yeah, narcissistic traits, and impaired these of identity, and able to depersonalize other people. He stated his conclusion that Nelson displayed many signs of manipulative behavior, the combination of which one man is lethal. The factors could be attributed to specific words bad, unspecified personality disorder from which McKeith believed Nelson suffered. In response to prosecution, content that in attribute attributing an unspecific disorder to Nelson. McKeith was undecided in his conclusion. McKeith content that the unspecified personal disorder was severe enough to substantially reduce Nelson's responsibility. Second psychologist to testify for the defense, Patrick Gateway, diagnosed Nelson with a borderline false self as a normal pseudo-normal, a narcissistic personality disorder with occasionally outbreak of schizophrenia, disturbances that Nelson managed most of the time to keep at bay. Galloway stated that in episodic breakdowns, Nelson became predominant schizoid, acting in an impulsive, violent, and sudden manner. Gateway added that someone suffering from these episodes breakdown is most likely to disintegrate under circumstances of social isolation. In effect, Nelson was not guilty of malice afterthought. Upon cross-examination, Green largely focused upon the degree of awareness shown by Nelson and his ability to make decisions. Galloway conceded that Nelson was intellectually aware of his action, but stressed that due to his personal disorders, Nelson did not appreciate the criminal nature of what he had done. On October 31st, the prosecution called Paul Bowden to testify in rebuttal of the psychologist who had testified for the defense. Prior to Nelson's trial, Bowden had interviewed the defendant on 16 separate occasions, and their interview totaling over 14 hours. Over 2 days, Bowden testified that throughout he found Nelson to be abnormal in a colonial sense. He had concluded Nelson to be a manipulative person who had been capable of forming relationships, but had forced himself objectifying people. Refuting the testimony of McKeith and Galloway, Bowden further testified he had found no evidence of manipulative behavior and that Nelson suffered from no disorder of the mind. Following the closing arguments, both prosecution and defense, the jury retired to consider their verdict on the November 3rd, 1983. The following day, the jury returned with the majority verdict of guilty upon 6 counts of murder, 1 attempted murder, with a unanimous verdict of guilty in relation to the attempted murder of Knobs. Crum Johnson's sentenced Nelson to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he served a minimum of 25 years imprisonment.
Now, do we want to run through the imprisonment aftermath, or do we just want to get right to the chase?
No, because he basically that's pretty much of the verdict and everything like that. We don't need to get in there imprisonment.
Okay, so
something like that, or the after.
Shooting forward in time,
his death on May 10th, 2018. Nelson had taken a HMP full stooching in New York hospital after complaining of several stomach pains he found to have ruptured What the hell? Sorry.
A subsequent, okay, and he had a ruptured
Aortic
abdominal
aneurysm.
aortic aneurysm, which was repaired. Although he subsequently suffered a blood clot as a complication of the surgery, Nilsen died on the 12th of May. Now, subsequent post-mortem examination revealed that the immediate cause of his death was a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal or peritoneal, I know I just butchered that, hemorrhage. Now, his body was cremated in June of 2018, and his service was held with only 5 mourners present, including 3 prison officers and the individual with whom Nilsen had corresponded while in prison. No family members were present at the service. Now, in line with the Ministry of Justice's policy, Her Majesty, Her Majesty's Prison Full Sutton paid £3,323 towards the cost of Nilsen's funeral, and his ashes were later handed to his family. Now, there are several artifacts from Nilsen's killing spree, to include things like the tub, the stove, certain pots and pans. They are on display at the Scotland Yard Museum of Crime.
Well, okay, if it's a museum of crime,
yeah, it's a museum. Now, with Scotland Yard, the way that they kind of do their museum, it's more of a it's more of a learning institution than it is like a public museum. And while it functions the same way, they use it more of a learning tool than anything else. So think of Scotland Yard as England's version of the FBI.
Yeah. So, but that's pretty much end of this episode, everybody. I mean, he ended up just dying in prison, so, which I'm happy about, but man, they had,
yeah, for people like that to be loose out on the streets of the world, it's yeah, it's kind of, it's hard to digest. Now, is there a lesson to be learned from it? I'm sure that there is, but it would take, I mean, on face value, it's, you know, don't go home with strangers. I say that, and we live in
we go to the bars and we pick up women, and the chances of either one of us dying throughout the nights. What's really strange though is I started actually looking at the statistics of like killers and everything like that, and it's like 1%, probably not even that. It's a little bit lower of you dying, but it's still possible, but it's very low, especially with like serial killers. But on that note, we'll go ahead and close out this episode, everybody. And thank you for listening and watching us figuring out Johnny's little part of the world, working his out.
We'll figure out the audio on my side.
Dude, as soon as you took off the headsets, perfectly fine.
Well, that's because I'm using the onboard stuff.
Oh.
But, I mean, I've got all this equipment here that I need to use, and so it's...
Yeah, we'll just figure it out together later on. But anyways, I'm David Dickerman, everybody.
I'm Johnny Skelton. Thanks for playing along.
Yeah, thank you for all playing along. Till next time.